Clara Williams stood in line at the bustling airport, her heart pounding with excitement as she thought about seeing her granddaughter for the first time in over a year. At 68 years old, traveling wasn't as easy as it used to be, but the idea of a reunion with her beloved granddaughter, who had recently started university, made the journey worth every bit of effort. As Clara reached the front of the line, she held her boarding pass and passport tightly in her hands. The young white woman behind the counter, Jessica Adams, looked up from her screen with a cold, indifferent expression. Clara smiled politely, her hands slightly trembling as she handed over her documents. Jessica barely glanced at Clara before turning her attention back to the computer screen. After a brief moment, she sighed and said flatly, "Your ticket is invalid." Clara blinked, her heart skipping a beat. She had checked everything twice before leaving home. "I'm sorry, there must be a mistake. I purchased this ticket weeks ago," she replied, her voice calm but tinged with confusion. Jessica's eyes narrowed and a thin, condescending smile played on her lips. "Ma'am," she said, drawing out the word in a tone dripping with irritation, "the system says your ticket is no good. I don't know what to tell you." Clara felt a flush of heat rise to her cheeks. She could feel the eyes of other passengers behind her, all of them waiting in line, perhaps growing impatient. Still, she maintained her composure. "Could you check again, please? I double-checked everything before I left," she said firmly, though politely. Jessica's expression hardened. She sighed heavily, rolling her eyes as if Clara had just asked the most unreasonable favor. With deliberate slowness, she tapped a few keys on her keyboard before looking up again. "I told you. It's invalid. Step aside." The sharpness of Jessica's tone cut through Clara like a knife. She wasn't just being dismissed, she was being dismissed in a way that felt all too familiar. There was an unmistakable edge of superiority in the young woman's voice, a subtle implication that Clara, an elderly black woman, didn't understand how things worked. Clara stood still, her heart heavy with the weight of injustice she had experienced countless times before. "Could you please explain why my ticket is invalid?" she asked, doing her best to stay composed. Jessica leaned forward, her voice lowering to a whisper that was somehow both patronizing and hostile. "Look, I don't have time for this. Maybe you didn't read the instructions properly, or maybe you don't understand how to book tickets online. But the system says your ticket is no good, so you're not getting on this flight." Clara's breath caught in her throat. There it was, the subtle insult wrapped in a cloak of politeness. It wasn't just the words, it was the insinuation behind them that because of her age and race, Clara must have made a mistake, that she didn't belong in the same space as the other passengers. Around her, other travelers moved through the line with ease, handed their boarding passes with smiles and pleasantries. Clara stood frozen for a moment, watching as white passengers were greeted warmly, without issue. She felt her heart tighten. But Clara was no stranger to this kind of treatment. She had faced discrimination all her life, and though it never became easier, she had learned not to back down. Taking a deep breath, she spoke again, this time with more steel in her voice. "I would like to speak with your manager." Jessica's eyes flashed with annoyance, but she smirked as if Clara had just made the situation worse for herself. "Sure," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. "Let me get him for you." As Clara waited, she could feel the weight of everyone's eyes on her. The whispers, the stares, the judgment, they all pressed down on her, but she stood her ground. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about dignity and respect, and she was not going to be silenced. A few minutes later, John Miller, the airline manager, arrived. He was a middle-aged white man with an air of impatience already written on his face as he approached the counter. Jessica leaned in and whispered something to him, and Clara saw the slight curl of disdain on his lips even before he addressed her. "Ma'am," he said, his voice slow and patronizing, "I'm John Miller, the manager here. What seems to be the problem?" Clara held her boarding pass out to him, her fingers steady despite the anger rising inside her. "I've been told my ticket is invalid, but I know there's been a mistake. I checked everything before I left home, and I just want someone to look at it again." John didn't even glance at the ticket. Instead, he looked Clara up and down, his gaze lingering on her worn coat and simple shoes as if sizing her up. The sneer that crossed his face was subtle, but it was enough to send a shiver down Clara's spine. "We have very strict policies here," John began, folding his arms across his chest. "If the system says your ticket is invalid, then there's nothing more we can do. We can't go around fixing every little problem passengers think they have." Clara felt a surge of indignation. "I'm not asking for special treatment," she said, her voice calm but firm. "I'm asking for fair treatment. I have a valid ticket, and I just want someone to take a closer look." John sighed, clearly growing more impatient. "You people always think you're being treated unfairly," he muttered under his breath, though not quietly enough for Clara to miss it. His words stung like a slap to the face. Clara's chest tightened. She had heard that phrase before, many times, from people who saw her skin color as a problem, from people who thought black people were always looking for a reason to complain. The familiar sting of racism hit her square in the chest, but she stood tall. "This isn't about you people," Clara said, keeping her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath the surface. "This is about the fact that I have a valid ticket and I deserve to be treated with the same respect as everyone else." John chuckled darkly, shaking his head. "Ma'am, if you don't leave this counter right now, I'm going to have to call security. You're holding up the line, and frankly, we don't have time to deal with these kinds of complaints." Clara's eyes widened in disbelief. She had seen this type of treatment before, where someone in a position of power could dismiss her concerns with a wave of their hand, simply because they didn't think she mattered. She had lived through decades of being overlooked and undervalued, but today something inside her shifted. "No," she said quietly, but with a determination that surprised even herself. "I'm not moving until you check my ticket properly." John's expression darkened. He leaned forward, his voice low and threatening. "I don't know what you're trying to prove here, but you're not getting on that plane. People like you never know when to stop causing trouble." Clara's heart raced, not with fear, but with resolve. She could feel the tension in the air, the way other passengers were watching, the way security was inching closer. But Clara wasn't going to back down, not this time. "You'll have to call security," then she said, her voice unwavering. "But I'm not going anywhere." John's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Clara reached into her coat pocket and pulled out her phone. She wasn't just going to stand there and let them humiliate her, not when she had the power to show the world what was happening. With a calmness that surprised even herself, she pressed record on the camera, turning it toward herself. "My name is Clara Williams," she said into the lens, her voice clear and steady, "and I'm at the airport where I've been denied the right to board my flight. They claim my ticket is invalid, but I know it's not. I've been denied service because I'm black." As she turned the camera toward John, she saw the flicker of panic in his eyes. For the first time, he looked unsure of himself, but Clara wasn't done. She was just getting started. Clara Williams stood her ground, her heartbeat steady despite the rising tension in the air. She could feel the eyes of the other passengers on her, some curious, others indifferent. But she wasn't here to be ignored or humiliated. For too long, black women like her had been pushed aside, their concerns minimized, their dignity attacked. This time, Clara would not be dismissed. "I'm asking you to check my ticket again," Clara repeated, her voice calm but firm, locking eyes with John Miller. The arrogance in his expression deepened, as if the very idea of taking another glance at her ticket was beneath him. "Ma'am, I already told you," Miller responded, his words laced with irritation. "Your ticket is invalid. Please step aside." He turned his head, glancing at the next passenger in line, as if Clara had simply ceased to exist. But Clara refused to be brushed off like a fly on the wall. She took a deep breath, feeling a familiar heat rising in her chest, but she kept her tone steady, refusing to let this man see her anger. "I've shown you everything you need. I've done nothing wrong. I will not step aside until you treat me with the respect I deserve." John Miller, now visibly annoyed, rolled his eyes, his lip curling in disdain. He raised his hand and gestured toward the security desk. Officer Greg Thompson, a tall, broad-shouldered white man with a stern face and eyes that gleamed with something darker, something hostile, strode over with heavy steps. His mere presence felt like a deliberate show of force. "What seems to be the problem here?" Officer Thompson asked, though his tone didn't imply he actually cared about the answer. His gaze flicked toward Clara with a mix of suspicion and impatience, as though her very presence here was a nuisance. He placed one hand casually on the holster at his side, his fingers brushing the cold metal of his gun as if he were ready to use it at any moment. Clara didn't flinch, but the gesture wasn't lost on her. The hand on the holster was more than a casual placement, it was a warning. It was a message she'd seen 100 times before: stay in your place, don't cause trouble, or there will be consequences. "This woman is causing a scene," John Miller said, the words sliding easily off his tongue. "I've told her multiple times her ticket is invalid, but she won't move. We need to keep things moving here."
Clara inhaled sharply, her mind racing. How easily they could twist the narrative, painting her as the aggressor. But she wasn't here to cause trouble, she was here to claim what was rightfully hers.
"I'm simply asking for fair treatment," Clara said, her eyes never leaving Officer Thompson's face. She wouldn't let fear make her small, wouldn't let the weight of his authority bend her resolve. "My ticket is valid. I've followed every procedure, and I've done nothing wrong." Thompson narrowed his eyes, leaning in slightly, his voice low and almost a growl. "You don't want to make this difficult, Ma. I am. We can handle this quietly, or we can make it a bigger deal than it needs to be. Your choice." His hand tightened on the holster, a clear and ominous threat. Clara's body tensed, but she refused to back down. This wasn't just about her anymore, it was about every black person who had been dismissed, degraded, and denied their dignity because of their skin. "I'm not causing trouble. I'm demanding my rights," Clara said, her voice firm, even as the tension around her mounted. "And I'm not going anywhere." The silence that followed was thick, charged with the weight of unspoken history. The crowd began to murmur softly, whispers spreading through the line. Some passengers looked down, uncomfortable but unwilling to intervene, while others pulled out their phones, sensing the situation might be headed for an ugly turn. John Miller shot a glance at Officer Thompson, who clenched his jaw. Clara knew what would happen next if she stayed silent, and she refused to let this moment pass without making her voice heard. Feeling the confrontation spiraling into dangerous territory, Clara reached into her coat pocket. Her fingers wrapped around her phone, and with a single decisive motion, she pulled it out, unlocking it with a swipe. "I think it's time the world sees what's happening here," she said quietly, but her voice carried through the tense atmosphere. She opened the camera, pressing record, her hands steady, her heart resolute. "My name is Clara Williams," she began, her voice calm but filled with purpose. "I'm standing at the airport where I have been denied boarding on my flight because of the color of my skin. My ticket is valid, but they've refused to check it again. They want me to leave because they believe I don't belong here." The lens of her phone panned to John Miller, capturing his cold, indifferent expression, then over to Officer Thompson, whose fingers still brushed his holster as if waiting for an excuse. As soon as they realized what she was doing, both men stiffened. John's eyes widened slightly in shock, but he quickly masked it with a sneer. "You're not allowed to film here," he barked, his voice suddenly harsher, sharper. "Turn that off now." But Clara didn't stop. She knew exactly what she was doing. If they wouldn't listen to her, perhaps they would listen to the power of public opinion. "Please share this video," Clara continued, her voice growing stronger, "because this kind of treatment happens too often to black people in spaces like this. We are humiliated, dismissed, and treated as if we don't belong." Officer Thompson took a step forward, his hand now gripping the holster firmly, his face flushed with anger. "Ma. I'm telling you, turn off the phone. You're causing a disturbance." Clara ignored him, turning the camera back to herself. "All I'm asking for is fair treatment. I've done nothing wrong. But they see me as a threat because of the color of my skin. I won't be silenced anymore. Enough is enough." She clicked a few buttons, posting the video to her social media accounts with a single caption: "This is how black people are treated. This is what we face. Share if you want this to stop." It only took minutes. Her phone began buzzing almost immediately, comments, shares, messages of support flashing across her screen. People were already reacting, their anger and outrage spreading like wildfire. The whispers in the line behind her turned into louder voices. Some passengers started filming too, their eyes now open to the injustice unfolding before them. John Miller and Officer Thompson exchanged nervous glances. The manager's calm arrogance was starting to crack. He wasn't dealing with just one black woman anymore, he was dealing with a movement, one that was growing with every second her video remained online. "This is ridiculous," John muttered, rubbing his temples as the weight of the situation pressed down on him. "You're blowing this out of proportion." But Clara knew better. The power had shifted. The truth was out, and the eyes of the world were now on them. "If you don't want people to see how you treat me, then maybe you should treat me with the respect I deserve," Clara replied sharply, her camera still recording. More notifications poured in. Activists were already sharing her story, calling for action, tagging the airline in their posts. Clara's video was quickly going viral, and with every new share, her voice grew louder. John Miller, now visibly sweating, reached for his phone, muttering something under his breath as he walked a few steps away to make a call. Officer Thompson, too, looked less certain now, his hand slowly releasing his grip on the holster as the crowd murmured louder, the weight of public scrutiny pressing down on them both. Clara stood tall, her phone still in hand, knowing that she had turned the tide. This wasn't just about her ticket anymore. It was about standing up to the racial injustice she had endured her entire life. And this time, she had the world watching. Clara's heart pounded as the camera in her hand recorded the injustice unfolding before her. The dismissive sneers from the airline manager, John Miller, echoed in her mind, amplifying her rage. Her chest tightened, but her resolve stayed firm. Clara was used to this, having faced racial discrimination all her life, but today she had had enough. From the corner of her eye, Clara noticed a man slowly stepping forward. Robert Johnson, a tall, unassuming white man in his late 40s, had been watching everything from a distance. His face was lined with discomfort, the kind that comes from witnessing something deeply wrong and feeling unsure about how to intervene. He swallowed hard, then cleared his throat, drawing the attention of both Clara and the airline manager. "Excuse me," Robert began, his voice trembling slightly, but laced with determination. He glanced nervously at Clara, then back at the manager. I saw what happened. I was standing right behind her in line. She had a valid ticket. I don't understand why you're doing this." John Miller's face stiffened with irritation, his eyes narrowing at Robert. He wasn't used to people standing up for those he deemed troublemakers. His hand twitched, as if ready to dismiss the man, but something about the way Robert stood his ground made him hesitate. Miller's arrogant facade cracked for a moment, but not enough to change his approach. "This isn't your business," Sir Miller snapped, his voice dripping with condescension. "We have strict rules and her ticket is invalid. We don't have to explain every decision we make." Clara could feel the tension in the air rise, thick and oppressive. She saw the way Officer Greg Thompson's hand tightened around his holster, his body language shifting from passive to aggressive in a heartbeat. His gaze darted between Robert and Clara, sizing them up as if preparing for the worst-case scenario. Robert, noticing the officer's movement, glanced nervously at Clara, but he didn't back down. His hands shook slightly, betraying his nerves, but he stepped closer to the counter, refusing to be intimidated. His voice cracked as he spoke again, this time louder, more insistent. "What's happening here?" "It's wrong," he said, his gaze fixed on Miller. "You're denying her because of the color of her skin, aren't you? I saw the other passengers being treated fairly. Why is she different?" Clara's heart swelled with a mix of gratitude and concern. She appreciated Robert's support, but she could feel the danger in the air. Officer Thompson's body language screamed aggression, and Clara could sense he was looking for an excuse to escalate the situation. The officer took a step closer to Robert, his hand hovering ominously near his gun. "Step back," Sir Officer Thompson barked, his voice laced with a thinly veiled threat. "This is a security issue now. You don't want to get involved." Robert faltered for a second, his eyes flicking toward the holstered gun. Fear flashed across his face, but he straightened his back, standing tall beside Clara. He turned to her, his voice softening as he spoke directly to her now, ignoring the officer's looming presence. "You're not alone in this," Robert whispered, his words barely audible over the buzzing tension around them. "We see you. I see you." Clara's grip on her phone tightened as she captured every moment. She could see the fear in Robert's eyes, but also his resolve. His small act of solidarity was a crack in the wall of indifference that often surrounded moments of racial injustice. The gesture, however small, felt monumental in the heat of the confrontation. Miller's sneer deepened as he watched the interaction. He took a step back, his hands resting on his hips in a show of false confidence. The situation was slipping out of his control, and he knew it. But Officer Thompson's posture remained tense, his body coiled like a spring, ready to pounce.
Clara's heart raced as the security guard took another step forward, his eyes cold and calculating. She knew the confrontation was teetering on a knife's edge, and any wrong move could turn it violent. But before the tension could snap, she decided to act.
She turned her camera toward the officer and the manager, her voice unwavering as she spoke directly to the growing audience online. "They don't want me to board this flight," Clara said, her voice steady despite the storm swirling around her. "Because I don't fit their idea of who should be allowed on this plane. This is racial discrimination, plain and simple. I need your help. Please share this." With that, the floodgates opened. The moment Clara hit post on her phone, the video began spreading like wildfire. Within minutes, her phone buzzed with notifications, each one a spark of outrage that fanned the flames of injustice she had captured. Comments flooded in, voices from across the internet condemning the blatant racism Clara had endured. Unbelievable. How can they treat her like this? Justice is for Clara. This is exactly why we need to keep fighting. At AirlineOwner, do better. The hashtags Justice for Clara and Boycott the Airline began to trend within the hour, and soon the video reached far beyond Clara's own circle. Prominent Black activists and social justice figures shared the video, using their platforms to amplify her voice. The collective outrage was palpable, and Clara could feel the momentum growing with each passing second. John Miller's face paled as he watched the situation spiral out of his control. His phone buzzed incessantly, calls and messages from higher-ups pouring in as the airline struggled to manage the sudden PR nightmare. The smug arrogance that had colored his interactions with Clara was gone, replaced by a flicker of panic. He glanced nervously at Officer Thompson, whose posture had stiffened even more, his eyes darting around the airport, as if searching for an escape. "This isn't good," Miller muttered under his breath, his gaze fixed on Clara's phone, as if it were a ticking time bomb. He turned to the officer, his voice low and anxious. "We need to shut this down. Now." But it was too late. Clara's video continued to spread, gaining hundreds of thousands of views within hours. The comments section was a battleground, with supporters rallying behind Clara and demanding accountability from the airline. Calls for boycotts intensified as more and more people shared their own experiences of discrimination in public spaces, each story adding fuel to the growing fire. "I was treated the same way last year at the same airline. We need to shut this down. Boycott the airline." This isn't just about Clara, it's about all of us who've been silenced. Time for change. Back at the airport, Miller's phone buzzed again, this time with a call that made his face drain of color. It was upper management. He stepped away from the counter, speaking in hushed tones as he tried to explain the situation. But even from where she stood, Clara could hear the desperation in his voice. He was losing control, and he knew it. Meanwhile, Officer Thompson's face twisted with frustration. The crowd around them had grown, with more and more passengers taking out their phones to film the incident. The weight of public scrutiny was bearing down on him, and he shifted uncomfortably, his hand still resting near his gun. He knew any wrong move could end in disaster, and the thought made his blood run cold. Clara watched the panic unfold around her with a mixture of relief and determination. For the first time in the ordeal, she felt a sense of power. Her story was no longer just her own people were listening, and they were demanding justice. She could see the comments rolling in on her phone, each one a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. And yet, despite the growing support, the danger hadn't fully passed. Officer Thompson's aggressive stance, the nervous glances from the manager, Clara knew how quickly things could turn violent. But she also knew she couldn't back down now. Too many people were watching. With a steady hand, Clara raised her phone once more, addressing her audience with calm conviction. "They tried to silence me," she said, her voice clear and unwavering. "But now the world is watching. This isn't just about me, this is about all of us who've been treated like we don't belong. We deserve better. We deserve justice." As Clara finished speaking, her phone buzzed with another notification, a message from her son, Michael. "I'm handling it," the message read. "Stay strong, Mom. A slow smile spread across Clara's face. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for everyone who had ever been silenced, dismissed, or treated as less than human because of the color of their skin. And this time she wasn't going to lose. The tension in the airport swelled as Clara Williams held her phone, steady and determined. Her heart raced, not just from the personal humiliation but from the heavy responsibility she now carried. Her recording had become a weapon, her voice a protest, her resolve unshakable. Officer Greg Thompson, towering over her, stepped in front of the camera, his expression twisted into a smirk of disdain. "You people," he spat, the words dripping with venom, "are always causing trouble where you don't belong." Clara's grip tightened on her phone. The blatant racial profiling left her breathless for a moment, but not silenced. She turned the camera fully toward him, capturing the ugliness of his gaze for the world to see. Around her, a hush fell over the few passengers who had been quietly observing. They sensed something important was unfolding but stood frozen, unsure of how to act. "Is this the kind of treatment we deserve?" Clara asked, her voice rising above the low murmur of the airport. "Do black people need to be humiliated just to fly? Am I being denied the chance to see my granddaughter because I don't fit in here?" Her words echoed through the space, bouncing off the sterile walls of the airport and sinking deep into the hearts of anyone who dared to listen. The few witnesses, like Robert Johnson, stood in disbelief, eyes wide at the brazenness of the officer's racism. Robert wanted to intervene further, but Clara's voice carried such power that even he felt momentarily silenced, struck by the weight of her words. Officer Thompson's jaw clenched as Clara continued, "You see this, everyone? This is what happens when we ask to be treated like human beings. This is what we deal with every day just for existing." Her phone now pointed squarely at Officer Thompson's face. The disdain in his expression faltered for a split second, but then his hardened features returned. He wasn't about to let this woman, this elderly black woman, make him back down. But even as his lips curled into a sneer, the weight of the moment was shifting. The room had changed. Eyes were on him, phones were up, and Clara had made sure that the world outside these airport walls would soon know about him. "I'll call the police if you don't stop recording right now," Officer Thompson threatened, but there was an edge of desperation in his voice that hadn't been there before. Clara, though trembling inside, held her ground. "Call them," she said simply. "Maybe they'll want to explain to the world why a 68-year-old woman is being treated like a criminal for buying a plane ticket." This was no longer just about Clara. She knew this was about all the times her people had been dismissed, overlooked, and disrespected. She wasn't backing down, not now. The battle wasn't just for her seat on that plane, but for the dignity that had been stripped away from countless others before her. While the confrontation between Clara and Officer Thompson escalated, across the airport, John Miller stood in his office, eyes glued to the screen of his computer. The video of Clara's ordeal was spreading like wildfire on social media, and notifications pinged rapidly on his phone. The airline was under siege online, and Miller's palms began to sweat. He barely had time to register what was happening before his phone rang with a sharp, insistent buzz. "Miller," he answered, trying to keep the rising panic from his voice. "Is this how you run things?" The voice on the other end was cold, authoritative, and brimming with barely controlled anger. "Is this how you treat passengers at your airline, John?" John's stomach sank. He knew exactly who this was: Michael Williams. Michael Williams, a major shareholder, someone whose influence stretched not only across the company but throughout the industry. "Mr. Williams," John started, but Michael cut him off. "That's my mother being treated like that," Michael snapped. "My mother, John. You have a black woman standing at your gates being humiliated, recorded for the world to see, and you think this is acceptable?" John's heart pounded, and he struggled to form coherent words. "Mr. Williams, I wasn't aware." "Not aware?" Michael's voice thundered through the receiver. "Are you telling me that you didn't know one of your employees, one of your managers, has let this situation spiral out of control? You'd better be fixing this, John, right now." Michael's fury was palpable even through the phone, and John knew there was no room for excuses. He had never anticipated that the elderly woman he dismissed as just another disgruntled customer would be the mother of one of the most powerful people in his company. He now faced not only public outrage but also the wrath of someone who could end his career in one fell swoop. "I'm handling it," Sir John said quickly, his voice shaky. "I'll personally see to it that the situation is resolved immediately." "You'd better," Michael warned. "And after this, we are going to have a very long conversation about how this company treats its black passengers. This kind of thing will not happen again." John didn't need to be told twice. He hung up the phone, beads of sweat forming on his brow. In the pit of his stomach, he knew he had just made the biggest mistake of his career. He hurried toward the scene of the confrontation, desperate to control the damage before it was too late. By the time John Miller reached the check-in area, the scene had grown tense. Officer Thompson, still standing tall, glared at Clara, though his confidence had visibly wavered. Clara, unwavering, continued to record everything, her presence radiating strength despite the intimidating atmosphere. Passengers had gathered, watching, some murmuring among themselves, others filming as well. The tide had turned in Clara's favor, and the manager could feel the walls closing in. "Mrs. Williams," John began, his voice unsteady as he approached Clara, "I deeply apologize for the misunderstanding. Let me get your boarding pass right now. There's no need for further escalation." He forced a smile, trying to control the damage, his hands trembling as he fumbled through the system, avoiding Clara's piercing gaze. Clara, however, did not move, did not lower her phone, and certainly did not seem appeased by John's rushed attempt at an apology. "This isn't just about a boarding pass," Clara said, her voice cutting through the air like a sharp blade. "This is about the way I've been treated. The way black passengers are treated every day in spaces like this." John blinked, clearly flustered, his forced smile faltering. I understand, ma'am. I'll make sure to handle this for you right away. We'll fix everything." "Fix what?" Exactly. Clara's voice was firm, steady. She was no longer speaking just for herself. "Will you fix the way your staff sees people like me? The way they assume we're trouble before we've even said a word? Or will you fix the system that allows this kind of discrimination to happen in the first place?" Her questions hung in the air, heavy and unanswerable. John glanced nervously at Officer Thompson, who now looked unsure of his role in the situation. The officer shifted awkwardly, his bravado gone, replaced by the creeping fear that he had misjudged the situation entirely. Clara turned to the growing crowd, knowing her voice had reached far beyond the confines of this airport. Her words carried weight, and John could feel the pressure mounting from all directions. Public opinion had turned, and the longer this dragged on, the worse it would get for him, for the airline, for everyone involved. "I'm not here to accept a rushed apology," Clara declared. "I want this airline to publicly apologize for the way it treats its black passengers. I want real changes, not just empty promises." John swallowed hard, nodding quickly, desperate to appease her now. "Of course, Mrs. Williams. I'll make sure the company issues a public apology. We'll review our policies, whatever it takes to make this right." Clara held his gaze for a long moment before nodding, satisfied. "You'll be hearing from me again. This isn't over." With that, she lowered her phone, but the message was clear. Clara Williams wasn't just fighting for herself, she was fighting for every person who had ever been dismissed, disrespected, and humiliated because of the color of their skin. And she wasn't backing down. The video of Clara Williams at the airport, denied her flight due to blatant racial profiling, spreads like wildfire across social media. The public is outraged, and the airline faces immediate backlash from all sides. Hashtags like "Justice for Clara" and "End Racial Profiling" trend worldwide. News outlets from local to national channels pick up the story, broadcasting the video clip of Clara being dismissed by the arrogant airline manager, John Miller, while the white security officer, Greg Thompson, looms menacingly beside her. The airline's PR team scrambles to contain the damage. An emergency meeting with senior executives takes place late into the night. As they review the growing number of negative comments, posts, and protests planned at airports across the country, the pressure becomes impossible to ignore. The company is at risk of losing not only public trust but also key stakeholders. The next morning, an official statement is released. "We sincerely apologize to Mrs. Clara Williams and all those affected by this unfortunate event. Our company prides itself on inclusivity, and what occurred does not reflect our values. Effective immediately, we will be conducting a full internal review of our policies and procedures. with a focus on addressing racial profiling and discrimination. Both the manager and employee involved have been terminated. We are committed to making real changes to ensure that no passenger experiences such treatment in the future. The statement, while direct, only serves to heighten the media frenzy. News anchors debate the sincerity of the apology on live broadcasts. Social media is flooded with comments, many questioning whether this is just a superficial attempt to save face. Across the country, talk shows discuss the broader issue of systemic racism, using Clara's experience as a powerful example. Prominent civil rights activists and political figures weigh in, calling for deeper investigations into not only this airline but others as well. The conversation spreads beyond the airline industry to highlight ongoing racial injustices in public spaces, workplaces, and everyday life.
Clara, now the face of the movement, finds herself at the center of a media storm. Reporters camp outside her home, eager for a statement, but Clara remains focused. She knows this moment is bigger than just one incident. It is about making real, lasting change.
Days later, Clara stands at a podium, facing an audience of journalists, activists, and supporters. It's her first public appearance since the incident, and she's been preparing for this moment. Her heart races, but she feels a sense of purpose or responsibility, not just to herself but to everyone who has ever been treated unfairly because of their skin color. The room falls silent as Clara steps up to the microphone. Her eyes scan the crowd before she begins, her voice calm but filled with emotion. I have lived 68 years as a black woman in America. I have faced prejudice, discrimination, and injustice in many forms. But what happened to me at that airport was not just about a ticket. It was about the value that society places or fails to place on people like me, on people who don't look like they belong. Clara pauses, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. She sees people nodding in agreement, their faces reflecting the pain of shared experiences. This isn't just my story. It's the story of every person who has ever been told they're less, who has ever been made to feel invisible, who has been denied the simple respect that every human being deserves. And I stand here today not for myself, but for all of us. We can no longer accept apologies without action. We cannot allow this to be swept under the rug with empty promises. Her voice strengthens as she continues, passion evident in every word. We need real change. Not just in airlines, but in every institution that continues to perpetuate systemic racism. We need policies that reflect justice, not prejudice, and we need accountability when those policies fail. The crowd is captivated, hanging on to every word. Clara's strength and grace in this moment are undeniable. She's not just speaking about the incident, she's speaking to a larger truth about racial inequality in America. As we move forward, we must remember that this fight is far from over. It's not enough to fire a manager or apologize on social media. It's about dismantling the systems that allow discrimination to exist in the first place. It's about creating a world where our children and grandchildren don't have to fight these same battles. Clara takes a deep breath, her final words echoing with resolve. I hope that my experience serves as a reminder that we cannot remain silent in the face of injustice. Together we will stand, we will fight, and we will fight, and we will ensure that justice is not just an ideal but a reality for all. The room erupts in applause, standing ovations filling the space. Clara's message has touched the hearts of everyone in attendance. Her voice, clear and unwavering, has become a beacon of hope for those who have suffered silently. As the applause fades, Clara looks out at the audience and feels a sense of peace. She knows that this is just the beginning, but for the first time, she feels that true change is within reach.
In the days and weeks following Clara's powerful speech, the airline's promises of reform take on a tangible shape. The internal review, which once seemed like a standard PR response, transforms into a full-scale overhaul of their policies. This isn't just about saving face anymore, it's about survival in the face of a public that demands accountability.
The first step is the introduction of mandatory racial bias training for all airline employees. Every staff member, from ground crew to senior executives, is required to undergo intensive workshops that focus on understanding implicit bias, recognizing discriminatory behavior, and fostering a more inclusive environment. Experts in civil rights and diversity are brought in to lead the sessions, ensuring that the training isn't just performative but deeply impactful. At the same time, the airline announces a new initiative to ensure that passengers of all races, ethnicities, and backgrounds are treated with respect. They install a passenger feedback system that allows travelers to report incidents of discrimination anonymously. This system is monitored by an independent board, composed of diversity advocates and civil rights leaders who will oversee any necessary disciplinary actions. The goal is clear: to create transparency and accountability in real time, so no one is ignored or dismissed the way Clara was. Other airlines begin to take notice. What started as one company's crisis response sparks a ripple effect across the industry. Competitors, recognizing the growing public demand for fairness, announce similar changes, implementing their own anti-discrimination policies and diversity initiatives. It's not long before these changes reach other sectors, with companies in hospitality, retail, and public transportation following suit. Clara, who once stood alone at the airport, now finds herself at the forefront of a movement. Her story continues to be shared across the country, inspiring others to speak out against the injustices they faced. She receives messages from people of all backgrounds, young and old, black and white, thanking her for her courage and determination. One day, Clara receives an email from a young black woman who had recently experienced a similar situation at another airport. The woman explains how she had been denied boarding, just like Clara, but thanks to Clara's story, she knew she didn't have to accept it. She recorded the incident, spoke up, and was met with an immediate apology from the airline. Clara smiles as she reads the message. It's in moments like these that she feels the true impact of what she's done. Her experience, her fight for justice, has paved the way for others to do the same. As the movement for racial equality in public spaces grows, Clara is asked to participate in panels, interviews, and documentaries. Her voice, once silenced at the airport, now echoes across the nation. She becomes a symbol of resistance, proof that standing up against injustice can lead to real, systemic change. In the end, Clara's story isn't just about her personal victory. It's about the ripple effect of one person's courage, the power of collective action, and the possibility of a future where racial discrimination is not just confronted, but eradicated. The fight for justice continues, but thanks to Clara Williams, the path forward is clearer than ever.